And now we are lucky to be joined by PSL member Eugene Puryear. Many of you know him. He's a longtime community activist, host of the radio show program By Any Means Necessary, author of Shackled and Chained, Incarceration in Capitalist America. Please join me in welcoming Eugene. He will be discussing the international legacy of the struggle for Black liberation.
Well, first and foremost, I just want to say thank you to Jonah Monet for coming and providing your artwork here. I hope that if you have the ability that you can buy some of this and support the work that she's doing. And thank you to all of you for coming out on what I guess is a bad weather day. I don't know. I've been debating that with people from other cities today, whether or not this counts, but a bad weather day in DC. So, there's a lot of things that we could talk about. It's Black History Month. I think the flyer for this was about Black radical history. There's many different things that can be said about Black liberation. I wanted to focus really on a few specific historical periods and examples that I don't think get looked at enough. But, I've been reflecting a lot on the Black liberation movement and Black history in the context of this Black identity extremism piece, especially over the past year. I had the opportunity to do an interview with Eddie Conway, the former Black Panther on the Real News, which hopefully is coming out soon. And we were talking a little bit about this Black identity extremism. And it's just interesting to see the context of this becoming a big issue at the same time that there's a marked increase in white supremacist terrorism as well. And at a time where you have, I don't know if you've even heard of them, this group called Wathan, which is like a hardcore Nazi terrorist group. I don't know. I've only recently become aware of them, but in just the last 9 months, they've already been linked to 4 murders or attempted murders and had several of their members arrested with huge amounts of explosives, one of whom had a portrait of Timothy McVeigh on his mantle, so that gives you a sense of where their mentality is. And in that context, you have the Justice Department not only refusing to call these people terrorists, and they have their own explanation, which is not relevant here, but also ending the program, the one program they had that allegedly was designed to address white youth who may be misguided and joining Nazi groups. And so why at a time where there's obviously a rising threat from these white supremacist groups, seems to be a concerted attempt actually on the part of the federal authorities to downplay that, where in the context of the Black identity extremism thing, which is allegedly about the movement for Black lives, which allegedly is an incubator for terrorism, without any real threat knowledge or anything like that. I mean, they try to, use the Micah X. Johnson situation in Dallas, but what's notable about Micah X. Johnson and the gentleman in Baton Rouge who shot those cops is that they were essentially lone wolves who were actually not a part of any organization and explicitly sort of doing what they did because they had a sort of a different view from, I would say, the broad mass of people who've been doing things in the movement for Black lives. And that's not to slight them, but it's just to say that it's an interesting juxtaposition. And so it just made me think in general about Black history and why historically there's such a fear amongst ruling elites in America about Black revolt and Black uprising and Black rebellion. A lot of people didn't like this cover, but my favorite New Yorker cover ever is the one right after Obama got elected with him and Michelle in the Oval Office, and he's dressed like Osama bin Laden and she's like Kathleen Cleaver. And a lot of people thought it was racist or whatever, but I thought it encapsulated how a huge portion of white America related to the idea of someone named Barack Hussein Obama, a Black person emerging from the sort of Black political milieu of Chicago, how they felt, like this sort of weird mix of radical communist Islamic, somewhat foreign-seeming terrorism. You know what I mean? This sort of weird view. And I just always found it interesting because Black people have always been and continue to be a distinct minority inside of America. So it just seems that there's a significantly outsized fear about Black rebellion in the country. And that's sort of what I wanted to talk about today and highlight a few historical periods, because I think that the real reason for that, and I think certainly history overall bears this out, is that given how central quote-unquote racism is to the United States of America, I think it's really difficult to actually conceive of a world without racism, or even moving beyond it, without trying to conceive of a radically different way of living in our society. And I think we've seen so much progress on some ways, but so little progress in other ways that even now, maybe more than ever, the difference between what could be and what we have right now, I think, is such a deep chasm. And I think that the dreams, especially of radical Black freedom movements, are so often not only complementary to, but oftentimes the vanguard of broader efforts to change the world. I think it makes sense when you think about how do we actually move beyond racism, and you have to think about living in a totally different way, that as it concerns other problems and other things that exist in our society, that I think really thinking in a real way of how to solve them also means thinking in a radically different way. It makes sense that these things can often move in the same stream. So I wanted to just talk about really 3 specific moments in history here. Are you worried that the light keeps going off and on? Don't worry about it. This is like it's like a slow strobe light effect. The club vibe is what I was going for. I wanted to start at perhaps maybe the very beginning, early colonial America. And it's interesting to look at because early colonial America was sort of a hodgepodge in terms of who was there, what they were there, and what they were originally trying to do. Most of the original colonial settlements, both the royal settlements and the those fleeing religious persecution, quote unquote, were more or less failed settlements. The ones sort of up north, the Mayflower-esque ones, had a little bit more vibrancy to them, same with Maryland and Pennsylvania and places like that, because they had a reason why people were coming there, which is that they were fleeing what they viewed as the inability to exercise their religion on the continent of Europe. But in Virginia, especially in North Carolina, and well, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, all kind of the same thing at that point, very little success, very little was going on. And then a guy named John Rolfe figured out that you could smoke tobacco, and if you did, it would get you high. And he took it to Europe, and I don't think you'll be surprised to learn people like to get high. And so, nevertheless, tobacco became the first cash crop. Everyone wanted it. Then subsequently, rice and indigo became a lot larger in the Carolinas. And so all of a sudden, you have this Chesapeake area that was really vibrant, making a lot of money. People were coming there, but it was still, again, kind of a hodgepodge. You have indentured servants who were coming from different areas of Europe, and it's worth remembering now, too, that some of these people were prisoners. There also was the long history of basically virtual enslavement of the Irish, where actually a lot of the sort of slave breaking techniques were originally pioneered in like 1300s in Ireland, and some even after and before that. And so you had people who were sort of coming from that experience. You had people fleeing from religious things. So you had a pretty decent supply of white labor that was coming. And in the context of indentured servitude, which is long periods of time, it was more or less what you needed. The first Africans come in 1619, and there's a sort of a weird juridical nature. No one really knew quite exactly what was going on. There was some forms of slavery that were not sort of racially exclusive yet. There was indentured servitude. But in these early areas, there were a lot of Africans who became free, were able to own land. Actually, there's actually a surprisingly amount in this area, the Maryland area, southern Maryland area, long history of black land ownership that was wiped out in the early 1700s. People could own guns, and they could also testify in court. So the things that for the vast majority of American history up until 1964, black people couldn't really do. They could do all of these different things. So there was no real sort of racially consolidated labor system. The term white as like a marker of different social hierarchy and law didn't really start to appear until the 1680s in Jamaica, the 1690s in Virginia, when it was actually used in a law that was designed to forbid interracial marriages between black and native men and white women, which also gives you some sense of it. But I say all that just to say that there was also quite a bit of social solidarity in this sort of unconsolidated system. Edmund Morgan, who's a famous historian of this, you may have heard this quote, it's a relatively famous quote at this day and age, stated that servants and slaves ran away together, stole hogs together, got drunk together, and it was not uncommon for them to make love together. And I think that in many ways, this was all perhaps most brought to a head in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion. It's kind of a complicated, long history. There's a lot to it. For years, this was sort of something that was held up by radicals, but there was a strong sort of anti-native feeling of it. But Vincent Harding, who's a black historian, whose book I would say, There Is a River, is a must-read book if you care about black history, described Bacon's rebellion thusly. Scores of blacks joined a motley group of white indentured servants, unemployed workers, and other lower-class and not-so-lower-class whites in Virginia's closest approximation to a large-scale class-based insurrection. And it was right after that was put down, when sort of the potentiality for something very different than the colonial elite plantation labor system that was developing starting to come to the fore, because you've got a situation where not only are natives moving away, but you have early maroon colonies where slaves are moving, joining with natives. You have white indentured servants who are able to run away and also join them. So a lot of initial danger. If you read the history of the times, the 1670s and the 1680s, especially in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, were considered dangerous times in terms of how much social turmoil there was. And it was after Bacon's rebellion that, as one historian put it, toward the end of the 17th century, there occurred a marked tendency to promote a pride of race among the members of every class of white people. To be white gave distinction of color even to the agricultural servants, whose condition in some respects was not much removed from that of actual slavery. And accompanying that came a number of laws that were passed that had one aim, as the governor of Virginia put it at the time, to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes. And I wanted to start with that because that's really sort of the incipient reality of racism in America. Certainly how the very specific system that we have now started to come into being, and a little bit of why. But most importantly, because I think, and this was the point I was trying to make in the beginning, and that I want to continue to highlight here, is you can see that the imposition of racism as a value, as a social system, and as a form of domination and oppression was directly linked to the needs of elites to secure their labor system. And that the idea of Africans who had come across these shores, who had to really redefine what it meant to be free, right? I mean, from the very beginning of slavery, there were slave revolts. There are many, many stories of Africans rising up before the ships left the coast of Africa. And in that context, what you're trying to do is relatively simple, right? You're trying to get back to where you came from. You can still see it. It makes sense, right? In the Middle Passage, again, any number. In fact, in the main routes of the Middle Passage, sharks would follow behind the ships because so many dead people were pushed over, and there were often so many revolts, they'd have to kill a lot of slaves to stop them from rising up. So there's so many that literally the sharks would follow the ships because they knew they would get something to eat just by following them along there. But I make all that point that the dream of these people in this country, which was very different, there's no real hope of going back, right, at this point in time. Like, that's beyond the pale, so you have to come up with some new form of existence. And in the context of the indigenous people, there is at least the incipient idea that perhaps there could have been a more solidaristic type of society that could have developed in different ways. It's an interesting historical question, but again, I just wanted to highlight that, how the dreams of black freedom were intimately tied up with the dreams of all people who were oppressed to have some form of freedom and to live a different sort of way. Hence it was so dangerous, and hence why they had to set up this system of racism to make all white people feel like they had some stake in this system vis-a-vis the most exploited, who were the slaves, who obviously had the ability to open up these new vistas. So the next period I wanted to talk about, which I think in some ways might be the most controversial if you know about history, but I think it's one of the most, in my view, misframed periods, but I think it makes the point well, and that's the populist movement in the 1880s and the 1890s. Populism is now a bad word. I know that's like Donald Trump, right? That's populism. Not 100% sure how that actually happens, but it is what it is. But the populist movement, well, maybe it requires a little context. I mean, to understand the populist movement, you got to understand the Civil War. You have to understand a little bit about Reconstruction, right? So after the Civil War, you have these Reconstruction governments. The Republican high command, if you will, during the Civil War was basically, I think you could summarize it down to northern capitalists. A little more complicated than that, but I think that's a fair way to do it. And their whole goal post-Civil War was to, A, be able to start to exploit some of these areas industrially. Mines, for example, the lumber industry, the steel industry, and so on and so forth. So that was one. Two, to build a lot more railroads, internal canals, and things like that to be able to more appropriately exploit the lands of the West that were now, especially with the opening of the Pacific Ocean, becoming a new economic engine, and also to open up broader parts of the South to labor exploitation. So like in the northern part of, say, Alabama, we have mostly small farmers, extremely isolated during the Civil War, even from people right around them, maybe 50 miles away, almost no contact at all. And so to be able to sort of exploit that and turn those also into cotton producing areas and other cash crops and food and things that existed like that. So that was basically their goal. And they had to give black people the right to vote and some role in the government, because that was the only way they could secure the South after the Civil War, because immediately after the Civil War, the slave owners were trying to find any possible way to come back. So they had to establish a military government led by black people that gave a huge mass base to the Republican Party and the ability to control the Southern governments. But that being said, they got control relatively quickly. So already by 1872, Civil War ends in 1865, the Republicans are stepping back, right? Because what they realized pretty quickly was that whatever else you want to say about slavery and whatever obstacles it may have thrown up to the development of capitalism, that Southern agriculture continues to be, and was extremely profitable. Continued to be extremely profitable. It was the basis of the rise of Wall Street profits, of the insurance industry, of the shipping industry, quite frankly, of the lumber and the labor industries as well in a conjunctive way. So you can see that really the cash crops that were produced in the South were a huge pivot in the overall world economy and worth quite a bit of money to many different people. So once you were less worried about the slave owners coming back in a renewed guise, and bringing back a system that you wouldn't necessarily want to see, that could put some roadblocks in there, the one thing that became really clear is you had to find a way to control black people. Because if you didn't control black people's labor, you wouldn't be able to return to the plantation system. And if you didn't return to the plantation system and instead, say, gave everyone 40 acres and a mule, you could have an economy, but a very different type of economy, and not a rising monopoly capitalist economy that was based off of exploiting these cash crop industries to drive a global economy. A very different type of way of living. So highly problematic, which is why no Reconstruction governments did redistribute the land. It's a different question. We can talk about that in the discussion, I guess. And why black people were forced into sharecropping. Most people, we think of sharecropping as bad, but at that time, it was actually viewed as good by most black people because it was viewed as a form of land ownership, and it was a sign that they weren't able to be fully reduced back to slavery. So it was kind of a halfway house between slavery and real free labor and land ownership. But that being said, all these things start to come into play. So by the time you get to the 1880s, the 1890s, you have a lot of issues. You have, for farmers, for black people, you have a lot of issues. One, just in terms of the reimposition of Jim Crow, or Jim Crow-like policies and many different other things. But black farmers, workers in the South, as well as white farmers and white workers in the South, were heavily affected by an economic downturn. Credit was extended to them, but on really bad terms in a really regulated way, so people were really deep in debt. The policies of the government put the government a lot in debt, which meant people's taxes went up. The railroad speculators would just buy up huge swaths of land a lot of times alongside these railroads and then sell them back to people at highly inflated prices, which meant that there was a unnecessary land hunger. So what you start to see is the base of the two parties, Democrats and Republicans, start to break apart, right? So Democrats were the party of white supremacy, essentially. And their pitch to whites who were not rich plantation owners was basically like, we are going to keep you in a better position than blacks. But here you have a situation where their white farmers, especially, but also workers, living situation is rapidly deteriorating, and what came known as the Southern Farmers Alliance came up with this idea called the sub-treasury plan. So instead of like the merchant in the closest town to you giving you credit, or some banker in Charleston or something like that on really bad terms, the government would start to give out all of the credit to farmers and also govern basically the way the crops were distributed to prevent people from A, falling into debt, and to prevent speculators from using their position in control of the warehouses where everything built up to help more heavily exploit the people. Democrats would not support the sub-treasury plan. So a number of these white, I wouldn't say necessarily poor whites, but close to it, then became disaffected from the Democratic Party. On the Republican side, you have a different issue, which is that black people allied with the Republicans thinking, well, this will protect our right to vote and our right to participate, and that just really quickly was not the case. It became very clear to them right off the bat that the Republicans had no interest and empowering the vast masses of black people to own land or to become economically self-sufficient, or even to protect some of the first all-black towns where people had bought their land freely and fairly and were having it stolen back from them. These Reconstruction governments were primarily not doing that. And then also you had a situation where the rise of Republicans nationally created a lot of space, a lot of federal positions, right? So there was a really small subset of like black professionals and others who could get these positions from Republicans. So it meant that they didn't really care about the broad mass of people. So it also created a new vacuum for the leadership of black people who were sharecroppers, who were workers in the new industries and the like, to start to become more politically active. And they formed something at the same time as the Southern Farmers Alliance called the Colored Farmers Alliance. Same basic deal, same basic plan. It was actually larger than the Southern Farmers Alliance. At one point it had just over 1 million members. The Populist Party had something called the St. Louis Plan, which was what they all adopted with a bunch of radical type of proposals centered on the sub-treasury plan. But I said all that just to say that it's an interesting piece because obviously black populists understood what was going on here. They were, on the one hand, in a position, so you have these two alliances, neither of them have either two political parties, both subsets of the masses of people feel very betrayed by their sort of elite friends that they thought were going to help them out, right? So they realize they can come together, and it makes a lot of sense why, say, the Colored Farmers Alliance would agree to that, because, first and foremost, they had the same problems, by and large, economically, and so therefore the populist plans made a lot of sense to them. But also, the only way for the populists to succeed was for black people to be able to vote. And the one thing that plantation owners tried to do, really starting in like 1873, really, I mean even a little bit before that, was constantly attack the ability of black people to vote and do everything possible to stop them from voting. And if they couldn't stop them from voting, just rigging the elections, right? Or saying, if you vote for someone I don't want you to vote for, I'll kick you off my plantation, or I'll stop lending you credit, or you won't be able to use my farm implements, and the like. So just rank intimidation, and of course terrorism, right? Just open racist terrorism. So the only people who were willing to defend the black people's right to vote were populists, because it was a life or death struggle for them. The only way they could survive was to try to leverage these gains that they were able to have there. They started something called the Southern Ballot Rights League. They also had something called the Gideon Bands. Now, the Southern Ballot Rights League was like a open organization that was about promoting the right for everyone to vote, but especially in the Black Belt South. So if you were going down there to advocate for this, you were basically marked with death. So the Gideon Band was a secret armed group of black and white populists in Alabama principally, but other places that would wage like a tit-for-tat guerrilla warfare against the Klan and the white supremacist terrorists to protect the right of people to vote. Black populists would carry guns to the polls to protect themselves and other people. So it gives you a sense of how deep it was, but how important it was to them in so many different ways. You know, in 1892, just before the Alabama gubernatorial campaign, which, you know, it's an interesting campaign, but maybe the high tide of black and white unity, the leader of the populist in Mobile, Alabama said to the assembly of black voters, he said, "I'd rather see every river and creek in Alabama lined with crimson, with blood, than to see you deprived of the privilege of voting." And I think you can add to that if you want. In 1898, which known as the Wilmington Massacre, really was an armed coup where a fusion black Republican populist government was overthrown in an armed coup by a racist band called the Red Shirts, and the government was just replaced in a coup. They killed, I think, 150, 200 people. It was all started because a guy named Alexander Manley, who is owned the one black newspaper there, he wrote a column that was, because there was all this stuff about how black men are raping white women. And he basically was saying that this is a false image of black people, this is a racist image. He said the history of slavery and the history of white men raping black women. And then he said, and there also are consensual relations between white and black people sexually in our society, and that's okay too. And so all the seeds were there for a racist mob. They whipped it up, they killed hundreds of people, they replaced an elected government because it refused to move off of the idea that sort of black people and poor, average, everyday people could form their own government in a way that could benefit them, not the super rich planter class of people. So, I mean, you know, look, there are many different ways to interpret this, and I think that one thing that's important, though, is that the way populism is often described in American history not often, all the time in American history. It's a time where black people rose up, where some white people allied with them, and then the white people turned around and betrayed them and stabbed them in the back. And that's true and it's not true, right? I mean, certainly when you go down the line, many populists subsequently became white supremacists, but what's always left out of this story is how there was this whole 10 or 15 year period where all these radical people, and in the South too, the Knights of Labor, which is a big labor organization, starts to join with the populists. They played a big role in supporting majority black miner strikes in the northern part of Alabama, lumber worker strikes that were majority black at the time, really talking about how do they build a totally different world for farmers and workers than the one that the big capitalists in the big cities wanted them to build, and made a lot of progress towards it. In fact, maybe a shockingly large amount of progress towards it given the deep, unbelievable history of racism. I tried to pull a quote for this and I couldn't do it because I had not obtained the document correctly, and so the internet shut me down. But it's a great quote from a white populist leader who shows up at a meeting and puts his arm around a black guy to make a point to the integrated assembly, and goes on this whole thing, and he said, we do the same work together, we live in the same type of houses, and he just ends it by saying, we even smell just alike. And so, I mean, this is like a pretty rare thing when, even the word social equality, like the races mixing, was easily something that could bring down a serious, almost warlike situation in almost any area of the South. It's remarkable to me that the populists succeeded to the extent they did, and I think it's even more notable that they had to drown it in blood and steal all the votes. I mean, you look at that 1892 Alabama election, and you go to the Black Belt, and for some reason, there are huge numbers of black people voting for segregationist plantation owners. Interesting. In 1892 in New Orleans, the populists weren't allowed any election commissioners. And so they actually got fewer votes in the mayoral election than they had people at their convention nominating the candidates. Now, some people would say, oh, they weren't popular, but I think you look at they had no election commissioners, you look at everything else. In Alabama and the Black Belt, the newspapers that were all run by plantation owners would openly say, after the 1894 election, they openly said, yeah, we rigged the vote. Well, of course. And we're not afraid that they had the ability to say it. So yet again, and I think this is the point that I really want to continue to hammer home, you can see how black liberation and fighting uncompromisingly for black rights was so deeply and intimately connected to any fight to how you were going to live in a completely different world than the one you did now, and that there was no way that those two things could coexist in a way that was effective without recognizing the sort of commonality of interest there, as well as the particularity of interest. So the commonality of black and white farmers on those issues, and the particularity of racism and how it works out with the vote, and also with integrated offices. The populists always had all integrated offices. They often had white and black committee people, something they took from the United Mine Workers, which would always do that, to show that they also believed that you deserve to have a right to leadership. So yet again, I think we can see the elites in America drowning in blood any opportunity to live in a different way than the monopoly capitalist one they wanted to live with at that time. And it's not surprising that after something's drowned in blood, completely crushed, and the Democrats actually subsequently, starting in 1896, co-opt half the populist program, that yes, some white people in the context of white America would go back to white supremacy looking for relative privilege. I actually don't think that's strange. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think what's more notable is the fact that that wasn't the case for so many people for so long, and that it was so tied to such a radical program. So the last period I want to mention here is sort of the post-World War II to McCarthyism period, which I think is obviously very relevant to many of us today. I think anyone who, well, if you watch CNN on a regular basis, then you know the Republicans are waging a McCarthyite attack against the FBI, which is just so ironic because it was the FBI that raised the McCarthyite attack against the population. But be that as it may, if you're perhaps a little bit more circumspect in your historical knowledge, you think that Russiagate has a lot of overtones to McCarthyism. I'll leave that to you all to parse in your own minds. But one thing that, it's actually, I think this is actually a sign of racism in America. I can't actually pinpoint any other reason why this is the case. The history of post-World War II era and of the McCarthyite period totally writes out the relationship of the black liberation movement to the McCarthyite drive. Which is strange because that was one of the most central elements of McCarthyism, was stopping all mass civil rights activity, period. It was one of their biggest fears coming out of World War II. And I've argued, other people have argued that I think you could argue that McCarthyism set back civil rights 10 to 15 years. And everything that happened in 64 and 65, I think could have happened in 54 and 55 if you had a non-McCarthyite world, but again, that's another situation. But I think it's one that's extremely interesting just as a period overall to note. But I mean, obviously, it's the end of a war, you have people coming back, and you have two things going on. On the one hand, you have soldiers who are coming back, and you have a large number of women who entered into the workforce because of the war and the labor industries. So amongst the working class writ large, there were a lot, like the most strike days ever lost in America were like 1946, 47, 48. So there was a lot of desire, there was a housing crisis, right? People couldn't find places to live. So people wanted jobs, they wanted places to live. They wanted a higher standard of living. And from their point of view, there was no reason why in this extraordinarily rich country, which was not only the richest country in the world, but think about this, all the other rich countries have been completely destroyed. So it almost sort of like stood alone and even more outlandish. And so people had higher expectations of what they wanted. And certainly black people, and this again is an interesting trend after the Civil War, after World War I, after World War II, after the Korean War, after the Vietnam War, black soldiers come back and they've been fighting. So they're ready to keep fighting and they're not going to live as second-class citizens in their own country, which is why almost so many, Medgar Evers was in the war, so many, we could go on and on and on, so many black leaders who were militant, were people who had backgrounds as veterans or in the war industries. On the other hand, though, you had the big business, right? And so you got to remember the whole context. So you had the Depression, right? So the economy came out of the Depression in 41 because of the war industries. And in the way that you had to work the industries during the war, they had something called the War Labor Board. So the government set up something where they had representatives, the labor unions had representatives, and the capitalists had representatives. And they were all supposed to get together and meet, and instead of there being strikes or whatever, they were supposed to find out what the best way to, solve the problems were without a strike, wages, whatever. It's a longer story, but nevertheless, you had sort of the first incipient military-industrial complex, and on top of that, you had the first sort of real, labor management relations, right? Prior to World War II, there was no labor management relations, there was class warfare. And even conservative union leaders still felt like, I'm a worker, they're the bosses, even if we can work together, the interest of my people and the interest of their people aren't really on the same page. So labor management relations, as it is now, which is a huge field, you can go get a master's in it if you want, that didn't really exist. So it was really World War II that pioneered the government and industry working together in a major way like that. And so after the war, you have all the big industries who don't want to tool down. They want to continue making a lot of money. And they also want the government to help them ensure the same type of labor peace they'd had during the war. So, the thing about that is, well, there's a lot of things about that, but the biggest thing was the most aggressive unions were the most left-wing, and they also happened to have the most black leaders, and they also tended to be the ones that were the most for civil rights. And so you had two big problems on your hands. One, just had the overall issue that the most radical, and they represented millions of people, unions, and even if not whole union, sometimes even the key aspects like Local 600 of UAW in Detroit, black-led, radical, but the biggest of all the locals in Detroit, were controlled by these radical communists. And they didn't really care that the capitalists wanted to go back to, or wanted to keep the gravy train running. Their job was to get better conditions for workers. And since many of them had also recognized that segregation was being used by capitalists to divide workers, they also felt, well, we also have to attack racism, and we also have to attack segregation. And so you had this nexus of left-wing unions, the Communist Party, and aggressive civil rights organizations, right? So you had groups like Sojourners for Truth and Justice, which is a group of black women that was particularly aimed at fighting the particular circumstances that black women workers faced, which is something that became a bigger deal. There's a group called the United Public Workers of America, which organized teachers and other government workers. That's why we have the Hatch Act. Anyone here works for the government, you know about the Hatch Act. The reason they had that was because they were having such success mobilizing public sector workers politically. But, I think that it goes one layer deeper because you had these industries that, of course, during the war especially, were able to bring in a lot more black women. And in the context of these left-wing unions, and the Communist Party created sort of a cultural matrix where Claudia Jones, and people know Claudia Jones, the famous black communist, was able to lead study circles and groups of black women, mainly public sector workers, talking about the particular problems of black women workers in the post-World War II society. And they came up with this idea of triple oppression, which is recognizing and understanding that black women were triply oppressed as women, as workers, and as black Americans, and that understanding, and get ready for it, the intersection between those three things, was the only way you could effectively organize a lot of these industries with large numbers of black women workers, not just public workers, but tobacco workers and the like. And don't be surprised when you never hear anything about that when you hear about intersectionality these days. But be that as it may, you can see in that sort of matrix not only the innovative things that were going on, but the major challenges that these unions and their sort of attached radical political organizations were the danger that they caused to super rich people and the elites. And that's when you get Taft-Hartley in 1947 to make it harder to strike. You also get the fact that unions had to register with the National Labor Relations Board and become essentially approved by the government. Many of these organizations that were radical, Civil Rights Congress and the like, they become subscribed organizations for being affiliated with communism. In the late 1940s, the NAACP started putting out lawn signs that said NAACP, not communist, and telling their supporters to put them in their yard to show that the NAACP wasn't communist because civil rights was communist. That's what they said. If you're for black equality, you're a communist. And that means you shouldn't be able to have a job. And that's really what was happening. People were losing their jobs. They were going underground. They were fleeing the country. People were committing suicide. All of the worst possible things you can imagine. People like Paul Robeson, the most famous person in the world, was completely crushed and destroyed as a public figure because of what he stood for. Henry Wallace, who'd been the vice president of the United States, was ruthlessly targeted for just trying to run for president against Harry Truman. And you have a situation where this is, again, a major inflection point for the country. There's two ways it's going to go. And Wallace promoted this in his campaign. He said that, look, labor can come together and we can build a society based on the technology and the riches that we have, where everyone can have enough of what they need and maybe a lot of what they want, where we don't have to have segregation, and where we can live in peace with the Soviet Union. We don't have to have perpetual war, because perpetual war will only promote all the things that we don't want. And the only people who preferred perpetual war, as he pointed out, were, poll tax, Jim Crow reactionaries and big business owners and Wall Street executives. So why would we want to live like that? And you could see how that might be a powerful thing if the vice president, imagine if like Joe Biden said he was going to run for president in 2020 on like the PSL program. You know what I mean? I think it might get a lot of people supporting it because this is something that had to be crushed. And I think that's, again, and that's the final historical point I really wanted to make there. You can see, again, that the black freedom struggle having such an important, critical, in many ways, vanguard role in helping people to imagine and envision a totally new type of society. And also, and I want to sort of end on this point, touching on, and I've sort of wove this thread through here, touching on why it is that this is so historically repeating itself, this sort of trend and this reality. It's funny to me that one of the most controversial statements you can make about black people in America is that black people are a nation within a nation, or a colony within America. It's considered a pretty controversial idea. It's one that's consistently rejected. It's only affiliated with radicals. It's often smeared as an idea that came from Russia, that was adopted by black people in the 30s, that has no basis in it. And I'm always so amused by that because, no one ever says that there's French cuisine. There's Italian cooking, you know what I mean? Like, you know what I'm saying? And music and culture. And no one ever questions whether it's an Italian nation or a French nation, when you could probably question it now in the 21st century if you wanted to. No one ever questions it. But no one will ever say that there's no such thing as black music, culture, history, or anything like that, but it's still controversial to say that there's a black nation. But I don't think it's actually controversial historically at all. You have people who are stolen from hundreds of different nations with long histories and their own reality. They're brought to a completely alien place. They have to learn to speak languages that are not their language to communicate with each other. They have to forge a common cultural, religious, social existence in order to spiritually sustain themselves in the context of 400 years of slavery. And that obviously has produced a very particular people, black people, which is why there's a certain type of black solidarity. Some people will call it black nationalism, if you will. I tend to agree with the Baraka. I think most of what's called black nationalism is really black patriotism. Black people are happy to be black and don't agree that we are inferior beings, and thus want to assert that consistently. And I think that when you look at how it played out, and that's why I wanted to start with colonial America, the genius of American capitalism and imperialism is that it set up a class system with intra-class divisions based on race. So like, even if you're in the 1% and you're black, you are almost certainly on the lowest end of the 1%, right? And it's sort of, I mean, now that's a good place to be, I'd say, for a lot of people, but I think it gives you a sense, though, of the genius of the system by making things appear, making oppression and exploitation appear as if it has a very different root than what it really, in fact, does. And by creating a level of relative privilege that's enough for people to fight over, right? I mean, when Robert Williams integrated that pool in Monroe, North Carolina, it was like the shittiest, tiniest little pool you've ever seen. They called it the Monroe County Country Club. And that's not there's a reason for that, you know what I mean? And I think if you look at how Donald Trump is succeeding right now, it's because he's taking advantage of the collapse of relative privilege in white America and the anger and resentment in white America against what appears to be the rise in relative privilege for non-white Anglo-Saxon heterosexual people. So ultimately, you're able to use this in a way that Trump can use it to be the biggest plutocrat in the history of plutocrats while claiming to represent the working class. Credibly. Every newspaper in America says Trump represents the working class. You know? I mean, so he can credibly do it, and it just gives you a sense where class as a concept has been defined racially, and gives you a sense of how deep it is. And that's why the black struggle is such a touchstone. Because when you talk about black people being free, you immediately are talking about the foundations of capitalism in America that have made them unfree. And it doesn't take a big leap to get from point A to point B, which is why the vast majority of black people who we talk about historically and culturally as heroes were people who were, at least to a limited extent, anti-capitalist. No surprise. Makes sense. And so ultimately, these inflection points, and why I brought them in, is I think they're major inflection points in America. The original colonial American period, the time when monopoly capitalism was being imposed, and when modern US imperialism was being established. That at all three of those times, it was absolutely crucial that the black freedom movement be crushed, because it was the source, and really the strongest source and component part of the dreams of average everyday people to live in a totally different way and to be free. And that's why they're calling the movement for Black Lives a breeding ground for black identity extremism today, because they know that the movement for Black Lives, whatever flaws that it has had, has unleashed in society a mass radicalization, especially amongst young people, that I think is very dangerous to the ruling class, very dangerous to the elites, something that I think we hope we can organize here in the PSL to become a material force to actually move this country in a more progressive, more people-centered as opposed to profit-centered type of society. And, you know, hopefully that's what we learned from Black History here in 2018. So I'll end there, and I appreciate you all. I'm sorry it took so long. I appreciate you staying and coming out on what looks like it's still a very bad day.